Okay, welcome to session 2 of the eye project. Today we're going to be using watercolor, experimenting with watercolor, practicing, again engaging in our newfound ability to draw eyes, but then taking it to the next step by bringing in color and utilizing our watercolors for that process. So things you're going to need for today. You are going to need your watercolors. You're going to need at least one brush. You can use the brush it came with. You can use some of the other brushes that you also received if you want to try some wider tips. You're going to need 2 cups of water. One is going to be your clean water, and then one is going to be for kind of basically just cleaning off your brush, which is going to get dirty. You're going to need a cleaned palette. Use your clean off your painter's palette before you start using this, because we're going to use this to kind of mix some water if we need to. Eventually, near the end, maybe on day 2, you're actually going to want your colored pencils, but you're not going to really be using them for the first day of this part. And then you're also going to need at least a 2H pencil, one pencil. And I just want you to use a 2H, and when you draw with this, I want it to be really light. What you're going to be doing is making just drafts of the eye project, and you're going to try to draw an eye, and then you're going to experiment with watercolor in a fun, creative, exploratory way. We're going to use some color pencils on top of that after, and you can even use regular pencils if you want as well. You might even use a little bit of Sharpie if that's how you feel, the thin Sharpies I provided. Here's another example of what you're going to be doing, just kind of experimenting, trying out different ways of using color. For many of you, this is your first experience with watercolor, so I don't want you to have too high of expectation. This is practice, so that when you get to the final piece, you feel a little bit more confident and know what you want to do. The paper you're going to use, just pull out a sheet of your sketchbook paper, rip it out, and then tape it onto your drawing board that's been provided to you. And then we're going to dive in. And the first thing you're going to do is you're going to find an area within kind of, the middle-esque area of your paper, and you're going to draw your eye. Make sure it's fairly large, but since you already have the steps for drawing an eye, I'm not going to show that to you right now. You can do that on your own, and then I'm going to skip to the next step. Wait, one thing before we skip to that step. Again, please make sure that you draw very lightly. I want you to barely see what you are drawing here, and then I don't want you to get too far into the details. Just do the basic shape and elements of the eye. I'll show you what I mean right now. Okay, so this is all I want, is a basic, very simple outline of the eye. I want you to take an eraser and clean up some of the other edges. I want this paper to be very clean, some of your draft lines, and then this should be even, you should barely be able to see this. Again, I make things a lot darker because I want you to be able to see it in the video, right? So this is where I want you to be at this point before you start moving over to the watercolor. And now we're going to do some playing around with some watercolor. And the main thing that I want you to know heading into this use of watercolor is that you are going to use it very lightly. Very light applications. Don't use too much watercolor, especially in the beginning. More water than ink, right? Than paint. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that right now. So I have everything ready to go. I have my paints over here. I have a palette that I can use for extra water if I wanted to. I have my brush ready to go. I have my water that is supposed to be clean water that I'm going to use to apply to my pigments. And then I have a water to clean my brush when I need to clean my brush. You should also have a rag on the side, a dirty rag, which I forgot to mention, that you can use to just wipe off your brush, or like a clean rag that you don't care about, not a dirty rag. Okay, so I keep that on the side as well. All right, so watercolor activates when water touches it. So if I take a dry brush right here and I try to scrape off paint, I'm not getting anything. right? Nothing happens. But if I take a little bit of water, okay, I dip into my clean water and I apply it into my, like, let's say my blue, and now you can see I actually have blue on that tip. So if I bring it over here, I have paint, okay? So it's activated by water. The cool thing about this, once it activates a little bit, I can pull some of it off and I can put it into a separate area that I can then add water to if I wanted to kind of play around with the right amount of water to pigment that I want. And like I said, I want you to start very lightly. Lots of water. And because I'm only using blue so far, I can kind of just add water into here with my brush, taking from the dark color. Okay, if I wanted to, I could pour a little bit of water in here, right? Just to make that even more of just a pull of blues. And I can make this for different colors if I wanted to. But I want you to be very light at first, okay? See how this barely shows up on the page? That's kind of where I want you to be with this, okay? Your first application of watercolor should be very light. And let's start by just kind of adding some colors around it. You know, and you can have fun with this. You can kind of like, you know, let it spill around, okay? And I'm just kind of going very light with it. You can make some kind of shapes and designs. You know, remember, like the ones I showed you earlier, the examples, you can have some fun with this, right? You can kind of make a whole bunch of different splashes and things like that. You know, or you could draw out a design and kind of go from there. But again, I want you to apply this very, very lightly, okay? Just kind of play around with it. Maybe I'm going to make some sort of like fish thing, you know, having tendrils kind of coming off of it, fins and whatnot, okay? This might seem a little bit tedious that you can barely see the color right now, but again, I want you to be very light. If you wanted to, you could come grab a little bit more of your blue pigment and you could darken it, see? I can add another layer, and this is how we work with watercolors, okay? Layering, just like we did with drawing, just like we did with the expressive painting project, you layer things. So the way that you shade or add value is by A, building out different colors on top of each other, or by coming in with more pigment on top of where you already went lighter. And again, I want this process to be very slow. I want you to play very delicately with this, okay? So I've got some blues down, right? Maybe I want to try a wider brush really quick. So I'm going to, you know, wet my wider brush, okay? Get some paint there, and I'm going to come back over where I already had some. You know, maybe I'm going to add a little bit of blue to that and just kind of darken it there, right? Coming in, going over, darkening it, and I can just kind of add a little bit more at a time. You can move the paint. You can see, like, once you put some paint on, so for instance, if I just kind of grab a little bit and I put like a dot of blue here, right? I can then come with water and I can really move that, right? And that was a lot darker than my last one, right? And I can kind of bring it into this other one, okay? So then I can clean my brushes, set them aside or whatever, and I can switch colors. So purple will go really nicely on blue. And I forgot to mention the first rule. The first rule of watercolor is be light, but the second rule is don't use the black, okay? I don't want you to use black in this process until near the very end or until you're much more comfortable with watercolors, because black has a habit of kind of getting into the other colors and muting them, dirtying them, okay? So right now, just stick to colors. If you want to use some brown, you can. Don't use black, okay? And the way that we use white is we leave those areas open, right? So for instance, well, let's do this first. I'm going to take some paint, or some water, and I'm going to activate my purple a little bit, right? I'm going to bring some purple into here. I'm going to grab it, put it into my palette. You know, I can also use the sides here to do this. That's what this is over here for. But I like using my palette because I can clean it a lot more easily. Okay. So, and then I'm going to grab some extra water, throw it in there, and then I'm going to bring in some purple on top. And the purple is coming on very dark. You see that? So I'm going to add some water into that area. I'm going to clean my brush a little bit. Okay. Then I'm going to pull this a little bit more with some water. You kind of see it spilling around, right? It's kind of mixing. And again, purple is going to go over the blue really nicely. So I want you to stick like within a color range right now. If you started with yellow, you can use some orange or green, right? If you started with red, you can use some orange and yellow. But try not to go for opposites. Don't use green and red. It's going to muddy it. It's going to turn brown, right? That's how you make brown, by mixing opposite colors, and those are opposite on the color wheel, okay? So you can kind of like play around with that. You can, maybe we can come around this area with some purple on top of the blue, you know, kind of spilling it in, adding it around it, however you want. Right now you're just kind of like playing, and I want you to pay attention to kind of what's happening as you do this, right? You can put a lot of water down and then just kind of like take your colors and kind of bring it in, right? And it kind of has a different application, a different texture, but you're just kind of getting a sense for how watercolor works. And again, you're working very lightly, right? Now, I'm going to clean my brush again with my dirty water. I'm going to try to use my rag to rub it off a little bit. I want to try to get as much of the pigment off, okay? Then I'm going to grab some yellow. I'm going to play around with the yellow a little bit, okay? And maybe I can play with that on the side, but maybe I'll just go directly from here, you know, and I'm kind of coming around. I'm using some color here, just kind of giving it some other elements. Come over the blue a little bit if you want, right? Grab some more water, clean water, right? Layer it. See how that layers, how the blue kind of comes over the yellow comes over the blue, and it creates a more of a green color in there, right? Okay. And then I want you to kind of focus in on the iris. And with the iris, I should probably go for a color that stands out amongst all these blues. So I could even go with the yellow, and maybe that's how I'll start. I'll start very lightly. I'll grab some yellow. I want more water than that, right? I've already got a lot of ink on my there, and I'm going to move it around, right? I put a little bit too heavy to start. Okay. So I'm going to lightly bring in some yellows here. And again, whatever color you did on the outside, why don't you try to find a color that contrasts with the inside, okay? So I'm bringing that in. Maybe I want to grab some more to kind of just spill it in a little bit more in those areas, right? Put it in lightly over there. Just kind of spread it around with some water, grabbing water, going back and forth. It's just a process of adding paint and water, working lightly, starting lightly, and then building up values as you go. And then maybe I want to bring in, do I want to go towards green or orange with the eye? Maybe I'll end up doing a little bit of both. So I'm going to clean off my brush. I'm going to grab a little bit of orange first. I'm going to pull this into another area of my palette. Just trying to grab that in. You don't need a lot. A little bit goes a long way, right? You can add a little bit of water if you want into there. If that works for you, be very delicate with it, okay? And then I'm just gonna spill in some blue, or some orange. Just kind of let it go. Just gonna drop it in here and there. Let it spill out on its own a little bit. Okay. Maybe I want to get a little bit of a edge around it that is blue, or so that is orange, right? I'm staying around this little light glare that I wanted to keep in there, okay? One of the other things that you can do with watercolor that's kind of fun, let me clean this off. I'm going to put in a decent amount of water right here, okay? I'm going to grab some blue. Okay, I'm going to do a little bit more. And then if you wanted to like blow on it, see how it just kind of blows and spills across, and you can see all these different colors kind of melding together, and my orange came in across and also kind of grabbed into these purples and blues. And maybe I don't want that, but after this dries a little bit, I can come over with some more blues and purples to kind of remove that area, right? So again, we're just lightly applying color. Maybe I want to blow on this a little bit more. Just trying to dry this area. I'm going to clean off my brush. Okay. And I'm going to grab some greens, actually. Okay. Just a little bit. I'm just going to kind of feather it in here lightly. It's still very wet, so it's dripping in. Go around those edges. Kind of bring it in like a line. Remember, thinking about the direction of the iris. And all we're doing right now is we're really creating this first layer of watercolor, okay? And then after this dries, you can come in and do a second layer. So maybe you want to play around a little bit more with these outer edges, kind of doing some more shapes, you know, coming in again with some blues if you wanted to, into there again, kind of coming over that a little bit, right? Maybe adding a little bit more color there, because that's going to be a darker area. Okay, spilling it in, kind of playing around with that. Maybe you want to bring in a little bit darker up here. And see how this area is very dry, so I can actually come in and almost, you know, more paint with that light over those lighter hues and draw with like some more specific lines, right? But where it's still wet, it's going to kind of mix more. See? So I can add some details and things like that as well if I wanted to. Okay? But let it dry after playing around for a little bit more, getting some colors in there, and come back to it in a little bit. Okay? Okay, so I just want to show you really quickly the difference in how the watercolor works on top of a dry layer of watercolor versus a wet layer. Okay, so if I were to come in with like some blue here, right, it's not going to just spill into the rest of my piece. It's just going to layer a little bit darker on top of that last one. It's not going to go crazy and kind of spill into all the different areas. And this is why, you know, this layering process is a little bit slow, but you can kind of see how I can just darken on top of that lighter layer. And I can do the same thing in my greens, right? So if I will go back to grabbing a little bit of green, I can come back over here and I can do a little bit of a darker edge, right? And it's not going to go kind of crazy. And I have a lot more control now over how the paint kind of moves. So I can add these values, you know, over on top, spilling them out, you know, however I kind of please, and even going over other colors, right? So again, kind of like shading, but done in layers, okay? This is all about being very delicate. And maybe I want to bring a little bit of green into here, like elements of green, okay? And maybe I want to go a lot darker, you know, on certain edges here with that green. And then maybe I want to clean my brush a little bit and pick up a little bit of blue again and come under here into this area with the blue, right? But again, if there's water there, it's going to interact. So be aware of that, okay? Maybe I want to use some blue to do some shading. I'm going to grab a really light element of blue to just kind of feather around the eyeball, and then just bring in a little bit more on top of that, right? Sometimes it's just going to grab and interact. This is kind of a fun, creative process, so I want you to embrace those elements. And again, same thing with the yellows. If I wanted to grab more yellow, right? I can do a darker value of yellow, grab more and more yellows to kind of bring around it, right? So I'm making it a little bit darker around those edges after it's dried. And see how you can get a lot more detail this way. So you got to remember, just kind of like work slowly. You know, I just brought in a very dark element of orange there on top. You know, and then you could see, obviously, I could let this dry and then come over that later, right? It's very delicate, very soft. Just keep playing around with it, do some designs, okay? And then after you've kind of gotten that to a point that you like, you can set this aside again for a little bit of drying, and I want to show you something that you can eventually do when you're really ready to move to the final step of using color. So I used this example at the beginning of this session of practice, and one of the things you can see is the hyper details that you get around this iris, the eyelashes. Even look at the circles that look like bubbles within the color pencil, and that is, or within the watercolor. That is color pencil coming over the watercolor. So once you've kind of, with your draft here, this is a draft, it's a prototype of what we're going to do for the final project. Once you've kind of like layered the colors as much as you want to, and you have everything kind of going, you feel good about the practice that you've gotten with the watercolor, you've lightly built up those layers over time, I want you to bring out your color pencils and start to layer on top of them. And let me just show you how color pencil can come on top of watercolor in these really great ways, okay? So I've got my color pencils out, and I'm just going to show you right away, starting with a dark green coming over my green part of the iris. So you can see that with a lot more detail, I can bring in a line on top of my color pencil, right? And I can do more details on top of the watercolor. The watercolor is like a layer of value that I can then bring in my color pencil on top of to kind of work within between. When you try to color with color pencil and you try to shade in an area, you can always see the white under it. Using a layer of marker or watercolor can really be helpful when trying to make your colors feel more full. And then also, the other thing that you can do, so I can bring in this on top of that, you can also layer with your color pencils as well. And again, one of the things I've brought up, over and over and over is the importance of layering. So bringing in yellow on top of green, right? You can do that. I can bring in yellow on top of this green I did over here, and see how that just makes that color more vibrant, more full. So using other colors on top of each other is highly, highly suggested with this process. And just kind of, again, you're experimenting. You're seeing how you can layer different colors on top of each other. So maybe I'm going to, lightly shade over in this area with some blues, some violet actually, and then come in with some cyans, right? And then bring in a lighter green. And I'm just kind of seeing how overlapping different colors lightly will make your colors more rich, more vibrant, more full. And then what's really cool about color pencils is how you can use white as an element that blends but also lightens the colors. So see how I have all those different colors? And now I'm going to come and move white across them. And it has like a blending, kind of lightening that hue together, right? And I can do that into these areas as well. Right? And then I can always come back over that with some more blue. And it's going to have a very smooth application to it. See that? So I'm just kind of, trying to be exaggerating with some of my elements so that you can see how that works. And again, what I want you to do is just kind of like play around with that. How can you use the color pencil now to bring in details within your piece? Do you want to bring in some white over some darker areas of your watercolor, right? And I can do that, and then I can even bring in color on top of that white, right? So we're layering, we're playing around. Maybe you could, experiment with using contrasting colors in some of these areas. This is a prototype. This is a draft. This is just meant to be practice before you move to a final piece. I just want you to see how you can come over some of your watercolor with your color pencil. And then, vice versa. We could bring back some of that on top of the color pencil after we've done some of that, okay? Be careful. You might get a little bit of a muddied color in certain areas, especially like, using complementary colors. It will pick up some of the watercolor. It will fade it. But again, you can come back over that too with some colors later, right? Maybe I wanted to grab some more, green and kind of just bring it into this area. You can do a little bit of layering on top of that as well. And then when you're going to finish it, you might want to come in with a either a darker, thicker pencil, or we can use actually like a Sharpie, pen, and ink, and then you can come in and you can end up like, doing your pupil, getting some of the details a little bit better around the eye. And this is maybe when you're going to actually want to add your eyelashes, right? And then you could eventually try using a little bit of black for that. Very carefully. Using some black. Okay? See? Just kind of coming over. But I want that to be really the last bit of, element that I bring into the piece. And then letting that dry. Remember, you want that motion. Letting that dry. Doing some shading. And then coming back over that again with some finishing elements, right? To get to this point where you have an eye that you feel really good about, where you've done some shading with the black watercolor in the background. You've done some shading with the color pencil. Just come in and finalize everything. Add those little details, those little outlines, okay? And then you'll be ready to move on to your final project, which is the next session. Cheers.